Hi guys, I'm back with another episode of my interview series. Today I have with me Kip Knott. Kip Knott is the author of two full-length poetry collections as well as full poetry chapbooks. His writing has appeared in dozens of literary magazines and journals, including the American Journal of Poetry, Barrow Street, Beloit Fiction Journal, Flash Fiction Magazine, and more. His writing has also been nominated for Pushcart and Best of the Net prizes. Currently, he is a teacher and art dealer specializing in vintage and antique paintings. He spends most of his free time traveling throughout Appalachia and the Midwest searching for lost art treasures. So let's welcome Kip. Hi, Kip.
Hi, Fiza, how are you?
I'm good. Kip, I'm actually very honored that you joined me today. I loved your writing as I told
Well,
you
thank
before,
you.
even we started the interview. So I really love your collection as well as your other poems and published in other journals. I want to ask you a lot of questions. So let me just start. Okay. So my first question to you is that when did you start writing, or what was the inspiration that encouraged you to write?
Um, I I didn't really start writing until I was in my early 20s. I, I I always talk about the very first thing I ever wrote was when I was about 6 years old. And my dad had an accident where he cut off part of his big toe with the lawnmower, and I witnessed it when when it happened. And so he had to have surgery and he had to have skin grafts to repair the toe. And they had taken skin grafts from his thigh and put them on his toe. And it made hair grow on the end of his toe. So he was always very kind of depressed that he had hair growing on the tip of his toe. So I wrote a little story for him called The Hairy Toe. And I did little illustrations for it and put it together and gave it to him because it was about the hairy toe being made fun of by the other toes on the foot. So the hairy toe ran away to find another foot to live on. And it made my dad laugh. And my dad is he's a guy who doesn't show his emotions easily. So when he laughed like that, it made me feel really good. But then I never did anything again until I was in college and at Ohio State. And I took a poetry writing class sort of on a dare. And also because there was a girl I was interested in who was in the class. And I thought, well, okay, that sounds pretty cool. So I went into this class. I had never written a poem in my life. I didn't really even know what poetry was. Um, and the first workshop we had to write about something that we were familiar with from our own lives. And I thought, I don't know what the heck I'm going to write about. So I remembered that I spent a lot of time as a child living with my grandparents. And my grandfather had been a coal miner, but then he was in an accident, and so he had to turn to farming. So I remember he had a garden hoe that he used in the garden that was just kind of worn down to nothing. I mean, there was hardly any of the blade left. And just home to. And I titled the poem Reclining Hoe, which has all kinds of connotations that I didn't intend back then. So I submitted it to this workshop, and it was all done anonymously. The poems were discussed anonymously in class. And mine happened to be the first poem in the rotation. So the poem was handed out to the students, and the professor of the class said, well, I usually don't do this, but I'm going to ask who wrote this poem. And I thought, oh no, I'm in real trouble. I did something really bad. And he's just going to go off on me because this professor had a reputation as being not very nice. And so I just kind of, raised my hand, and he said, well, I just want to say this is a remarkable poem to start a class like this. And he went on and talked for about 10 minutes about how good the poem was, which I just described the hoe. That's all I did. And I couldn't figure out what was so good about it, even though he was explaining to the class what was so good about it. And so I thought, oh, wow, okay, that's interesting. And everything else I wrote after that for the class, his way of grading was you had to go into his office at the end of the semester and he asked you what grade you thought you deserved. And I said, well, based on my first poem, I think I probably deserve an A. And he's like, no. He's like, that was a really good poem, but everything you wrote after that was shit. And so he gave me a B in the class. But you could retake the class as many times as you wanted. So I kept retaking the class because I wanted to get an A, and I wanted him to tell me that as the first poem I wrote. It took me 2 years. And finally, he said, okay, you've written a poem. So I really kind of got into writing poetry because I had a chip on my shoulder. And I wanted to make this professor tell me I'd written at least 2 good poems.
I really liked that, you kept trying and then you finally got there. Like, perseverance is the key to what you really want to achieve. So, yeah, so maybe that is the reason that, you kept on trying and then you have so many achievements now. So, we'll talk about that later as well. So, my next question to you is, what kind of themes do you usually explore when you are writing?
A lot of it depends on where I'm at in my life. For a long time, the first poems I wrote, the earliest poems, were pretty much based on stories I had heard from my grandparents about their lives. They led hard lives. They grew up during the Depression. They raised 3 sons during the Depression. And like I said, my grandfather was a coal miner until he was he had an accident. There was an explosion in the coal mine that forced him out, and so he had to turn to farming. And my grandmother worked in a shoe factory, and they were from an area of Ohio where I spent a lot of time. That's part of northern Appalachia, so it was a very depressed area, full of really an odd mixture of people. You had a real mix of ethnicities, class. So it was just a real rich area for me to grow up in. And so a lot of the early poems I wrote were about that area, about those people. And then as I moved on, I started to explore sort of broader themes, and I sort of explored things that happened. I was married to somebody right out of college, and that marriage didn't last, and so that raised a lot of issues in my life that I thought I needed to explore. So I actually left Ohio for about 10 years, and I lived in Alaska for 3 of those years, and then Iowa, Oklahoma. So I did a lot of traveling. I got remarried, sort of centered myself, and then had a kid. Having a child really changes your perspective on things, and suddenly you have to start thinking about, wow, what things do I want to try and explain to my child in my writing that nobody explained to me. So a lot of what I wrote after he was born was pretty much for him, sort of me trying to sort out what the world is, the impact that we have on the world politically, environmentally, emotionally. So those things really started to creep into my writing. And then lately, I've been writing a lot about grief. And I think the pandemic has had a lot to do with that, just seeing the number of people globally who have died because of the pandemic. And it's made me think about how shocking that is for us, because the past few generations haven't had to deal with grief in the same way that earlier generations did. Grief used to be much more of a hands-on personal experience, where when somebody would die, the family had to prepare the body themselves and sit with the body. And grief became something that we would sort of hand off. Once funeral homes became big business, we would kind of hand off all of those things that we used to do to somebody else. So we sort of experienced grief from a distance. But I think that's changed now because so many people have been touched by this. I mean, everyone I know knows somebody who's died from the pandemic. And so I think that's really gotten me to think a lot about how do we grieve? What's the grieving process like? So a lot of the newer stuff I've been writing, and a lot more of it has been prose, actually. I've been writing a lot of stories that deal with grief in some way.
So, as you have mentioned that you have now written about grief, and pandemic has also impacted your way of writing. So, what kind of other other genres of grief or other angles of grief do you really explore when you are writing about grief? So, what is your take on grief? Like, how do you see it? Like, when you are writing something, does when you does grief help you in in expressing your thoughts in a poem, or it's become a question that you are trying to explore through poetry? I hope I'm clear.
Yeah, no, you are. I've been trying to come at it from as many different angles as possible. I've been looking at grief as something that can sort of paralyze a person into not being able to reach out to other people. I've been exploring grief as a release for some people. I've been looking at grief as inspiration for art. So I wrote a series of poems during the pandemic based on Andrew Wyeth's paintings of Helga. Andrew Wyeth is a famous American artist known for mostly his landscapes of Maine and Pennsylvania. But secretly for about 15 years, he painted portraits, really intimate portraits of this woman named Helga Testorf. So he and Helga were the only two people who knew these paintings existed until the secret got out. And they're some of his best paintings. And it's all, I wrote a series of poems that are ekphrastic poems. They're based on specific paintings, but they're also persona poems because I write them in the voice of Wyeth, because I'm trying to get at a kind of grief that he may have, or at least that I assumed he felt, for not being able to consummate that relationship, because both he and Helga have said, they said repeatedly, Wyeth's been dead for a while now, that it wasn't a physical relationship. It was just purely an artist and model, and they were very close and they loved one another, but it wasn't that kind of relationship. But I think that when you spend that much time with somebody in secret, there has to be some part of you that is grieving something there, to keep it secret. So that's what I explored in those poems. That's a different kind of grief than the loss of a loved one. But that's just an example of one area of grief. So I'm not trying to come at grief from necessarily a traditional perspective, although I do in some of this stuff. I'm trying to look at it from all these different ways. What are all the different things that we can grieve in our lives? Yeah, death, of course, is what we most associate grief with, but there are other things that we, grieve in our lives: missed opportunities, not being able to express yourself the way that you want to. And I think Wyeth is a good example of that. I think he was sort of trapped by his reputation and by the kind of paintings he made. the Helga paintings were an opportunity for him to just paint what he wanted to paint for himself. And so I think that, that's a kind of grief that he was exploring in his work. So it's been difficult in some ways to do this, because I kind of have to put myself in that mentality. And I mean, in my daily life, I'm not a morose person, but it's just funny because everything I write seems to be more morose than I actually am. And I had just written a news story about a month ago about two boys who were flying a kite around high voltage power lines. And so I gave it to my wife, and she was just, I could see her. She was just all tense when she was reading it. And then she got to the end, she's like, "Oh, good. I thought for sure you were going to kill one of the boys, having them get electrocuted." And I said, "Yeah, I thought about it, but then I thought, you know what? I'm gonna let them live this time. I've got that power, so I thought I'm gonna let them live and just make this kind of a sweet story about brotherly love."
Okay, so I want to ask you about that, like based on the story that you recently talked about. So how difficult it is for you, or how easy it is for you to take decisions for your characters? Like you consciously make that choice, or you let your story or your characters define what they want to do? How do you go about it?
I pretty much let the characters lead me where they want to go. It, Typically when I write, and the process for writing a poem and writing a story for me is the same. It usually begins with an image or a line or a sentence will pop into my head, and so I write it down, and then I say, okay, what comes next? And then I do that. It's just sort of, I build things one sentence at a time, and I just see where is it going to lead me. Now with a poem, it's usually one image will lead me to another image, to another, and then I look for the connections. I look for the sort of through line that's uniting all of these images. In a story, it's the characters. So if I have a sentence or a phrase or an image that I write down, that leads me to a character. Okay, who relates to this phrase in some way, and then I come up with a character, and then I just see where the character's leading me. And when I started to write the story about the two boys flying the kite, I thought for sure at the beginning, well, this is going to lead to a death, and it's going to be a life-changing experience. But as as I was writing it, and as I was approaching what I thought was going to be the scene where one of them dies, the interaction between the two boys, it's like, no, that's not what's supposed to happen between them. That the life-changing event is not something tragic like a death. It's just a realization between the two that there's more to life than the small town that they feel trapped in. There's more to life than the parents who don't seem to have the time for them, and they have one another, and they can build a life on the relationship that they have. So yeah, and in poetry, it's the images that sort of lead me in a certain direction. I don't try and force images to fit into a particular slot. I mean, I've tried doing that in the past, and the result is just really horrible. And I've tried sort of manipulating characters in my stories to do certain things. And then when I go back and read it, it's just like, well, that's not right for that character. If that character was sitting next to me, he or she would be really upset that I made them do that. So I've got to go back in and change that.
Okay, so I want to ask you about this kind of styles that you usually, write in. So as you have talked about acrostic poems, then persona poems. So are there any other styles that you usually try to work on?
Yeah, I love deep imagery. I love the deep imagist poets, James Wright, Robert Bly, Gregory Orr. But then um, I love poets who are much more narrative, confessional. I mean, Plath, there's a lot about Plath. I love Elizabeth Bishop. Um, I like a lot of the modernist poets. So when I write, it usually it's kind of like letting characters sort of push me in a certain direction, depending on what the image is or the phrase or the sentences that I put down. That sort of leads me, either this is going to be a much more narrative poem, or it's going to be a much more compact, shorter, deep images poem. And I love those. I love really short poems that require the reader to make a lot of the connections for themselves. With narrative poems, they can serve a purpose, and I try and mix it up. When I'm putting a book together, I look at all the poems I've got, and I want there to be kind of a mixture of different forms, more traditional, some that are slightly more experimental, deep images poems, narrative poems. But I don't sit down and think, okay, I'm going to write this book and I want to have half of it deep image poems and half of it narrative. I just look at what I have and I see what fits together, where, what group of poems need to be together in a book. And you can see in Clean Coal Burn, there is that mix. There's a lot of deep image poems, which are those are poems that I wrote really early. I was really almost exclusively a deep images poet at the very beginning of when I started writing and publishing. But then as I wanted to tell more and more of these stories that I had heard from my grandparents, it just sort of transitioned into these more narrative poems. But I still like to have those deep image elements in a narrative poem. And I several years ago, I wrote a screenplay too. And the screenplay, it's such an odd thing to write, because it's like a novel. It's sort of long form, like a novel, but it's comprised of scenes that sort of work as short stories, but then you have to have these moments and scenes that are very poetic. So it's just sort of like it combines all of those genres into one. And I sort of have the same approach when I write a poem. I like there to be moments of just pure imagery that seem slightly mysterious, where it's not everything is explained, that something will pop in there where the reader has to kind of think for a moment, okay, what's the connection? So I like to incorporate a lot of different kinds of forms into one poem sometimes, but usually when I'm putting a book together, the end result is there are lots of different forms. And I've been criticized by that. I had one professor when I was working on my PhD, when I first met with him, the first semester I was there in the program, he looked at me and he's like, you're never going to go anywhere. Your writing's all over the place. He's like, I can't figure out what style you are. I said, why do I have to be one particular style? Why can't I try lots of different things? And he's like, oh, you just can't do that. Well, I think you can.
Okay, so I want to ask you another question, and that is, you have received writing grants from Ohio Arts Council and Poetry and Pushcart, as well as your work has been nominated for Pushcart and Best of the Net prizes. So, how those achievements have defined your way, the way you look at writing now, if they have, or how do you see them? How have they encouraged you to work on your craft, or do even better?
I don't even think about those things when I'm writing. And I've been writing for a long time, more than 30 years now. And it wasn't until last year. I had never gotten a Pushcart nomination or a Best of the Net nomination until last year. And for a long time, I got a MFA in creative writing from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then I studied. I didn't complete, but I studied my PhD in creative writing at Oklahoma State. And so I've spent a lot of time in creative writing workshops, and those programs, they try and get you to think about that stuff when you write. They try and get you to think about, well, who might be interested in publishing this? What awards can you apply for? And that always kind of really bothered me. It's like, you shouldn't be thinking about about that stuff. You can't predict what someone's going to like, and you can't write trying to predict what somebody's going to like. You just have to write what is honest for you. So yeah, I don't think about those things, but I was shocked last year when I got the Pushcart nominations and the Best of the Net nominations, because like I said, I'd never gotten those before. The grants, the first grant I got I was really young. The first grant I got was in, I think, 1990 from the Ohio Arts Council. And I just applied because the process was simple. I mean, I just had to take a group of poems, put them together, Xerox copy like 4 copies of it, and submit it, fill out an application and submit it. And I thought, I'm never going to get this, but why not? And I submitted, and I won one. I was shocked that I had won one. And then when we moved back to Ohio, finally after 10 years, my wife and I moved back in 2001, and I applied for another Ohio Arts Council grant after we were here for a year, but that one was in playwriting. And again, I didn't expect to get anything, but I thought the process is easy. Why not? It doesn't cost anything. So I submitted and I won another one. So it's not something that I don't have these files that these are for grants. These are for this magazine, these are for that magazine. I'm just happy to get people to read my stuff. And when I was in the creative writing workshops, when I was up in Alaska, there really weren't any online literary magazines. The internet was just starting then. When I was working on my PhD, there were, but there was a real bias in the programs against anything that was online. Anything that was online was considered to be subpar, and you shouldn't, if you're a serious writer, you don't submit online. I thought that was ridiculous. It's like, why does that make any difference? I mean, the whole point is trying to get people to read your stuff, and so few people read some of these literary magazines because they're so expensive. People can't afford to buy them. So during the pandemic, that's when I started to submit to more online magazines. And a lot of it was my wife, Dana. She was the one who would find these magazines, and she was like, you know what, you ought to submit. And she hooked me up with Versification, which has turned out to be a great thing. And so I thought, okay, yeah, I'll let me read these and see if I like the stuff that they're publishing. And in so many cases I did. There was so much good writing out there. So I thought, well, I'll submit and see if anything comes of it. And I published more stuff last year in 1 year than I have in the 30 years before. And then I got what, 2 or 3 Pushcart nominations and 2 or 3 Best of the Net nominations, which made me think these people really care about the writers that they're publishing. And I never felt that way with a lot of the literary magazines that I published in. And I've published in some really big ones, Virginia Quarterly and Gettysburg Review, but I never felt like, you might see a cattail pop in here and there. I never really felt like, I almost felt like I was filler when I would get something accepted, that they didn't really care so much about my stuff. They needed some stuff. They took some of my stuff. And that was sort of there was never a relationship built with any of those editors. With the stuff that I've gotten published online, I've built so many relationships with editors. It's terrific. I love it. And there's just there's a personalization to it that I just never got with the print journals I was published in. And that's, I'm not knocking those print journals. I love a lot of what they publish, but the other thing is they take so long to reply. I mean, with Gettysburg Review, I submitted stuff and it was a year. A year later, I heard from them and they wanted all 4 of the poems I had submitted, but they had to ask, are they still available? That they were. So I said, yeah, you can have them, but that was a year. Now that's ridiculous. I was an editor of a magazine. I've been an editor of a magazine a couple of places, and I always had the philosophy: read it. If you like it, accept it. If you don't, return it. It's that simple. You don't have a pile where you say, well, here are the maybes, and let's see if something better comes in. That's not right. It's just, you should know if you like it and you want other people to read it, then you should publish it. If you don't publish it. It should be that simple. But and I think it is that simple for a lot of the online editors, which I really appreciate. And I've probably had more people read my stuff in the last year than in 30 years.
Okay, so my next question to you is, since you have mentioned in your bio that you are a teacher as well as an art dealer who specializes in vintage and antique painting. So I want to ask you that how close do you see the relationship between poetry and painting?
Oh, I see a direct connection. And it's funny because earlier when I started writing, like I said, I didn't really know what I could write about. And after that first poem, Reclining Hoe, then I thought, well, what the heck am I going to write about? I hadn't really done a whole lot in my life that I thought was very interesting. So I started to turn to art. And I would write poems about paintings, usually about paintings by Vincent van Gogh, because I loved Van Gogh's paintings. I knew a lot about Van Gogh. He had been a preacher to coal miners. And since my grandfather was a coal miner, I felt a connection there. And so I would write poems about his paintings. And I had no idea when I was doing it that was even a thing. I had never heard the term ekphrastic poetry before. And finally, somebody, when I had turned in like my 3rd or 4th poem about a Van Gogh painting, someone said, would you stop writing these ekphrastic poems? I'm like, what the heck's an ekphrastic poem? And they said, what you're doing, you're writing about paintings. Those are called ekphrastic poems. I had no clue. I didn't know it was anything. So for me personally, I've always been drawn to paintings. If I ever find I'm having writer's block, I'll open a book of an artist that I have. I'll read the biography. I'll look at the paintings, or a lot of times I'll watch a documentary about an artist, and that really sort of gets the juices flowing, because the paintings are really poems. They're put on canvas. Even the most realistic paintings, there are elements of poetry in them. There's a kind of figurative language in even the most realistic painting that I think is telling us something about the artist, whether the artist wants it there or not. So I think, yeah, there's a definite direct connection to it. And I went through one of the reasons I got into selling art is I went through a long period where I really wasn't writing very much, and I needed some sort of outlet. And I like to go around to antique stores and flea markets and stuff and just look for things. I've always done that since I was a kid. I got that from my mom. And one day I was out and I found a painting at this really junky shop. This painting had no business being in this shop. I mean, this shop had mostly, chipped dishes and dirty toys that they were reselling. And it was just a really junky shop. But hanging on the wall was this gorgeous painting of a pheasant flying out of a cornfield, just beautiful. And they wanted $50 for the painting. And so I ended up bargaining down to $35. And I got the painting and I called my wife and I said, can you look this artist up for me really quickly? I think he's really an important artist. And she did. She looked him up and he was. And so I took the painting to an auction house. We have a pretty prestigious auction house not far from us. And yeah, they said, yeah, this is a really, really good painting. And so I sold it at auction for $7,500. I paid $35 for it. And so that got me into the business. But what really got me into it was I sell paintings on eBay and I sell paintings on Etsy. But I started to just buy paintings by lesser known artists and just researching their lives. And then I would write a story about who they were. And I found a painting by the first woman who was ever a Marine in the United States. And so that's how I sold it. It wasn't a very good painting, but because it was done by this woman and I told her story, that got somebody interested in it. So I was still writing, but I was doing it with this kind of consumer purpose, telling the story of these artists and selling their works. And that kind of saw me through this sort of dry period of writing. But when the pandemic started, Dana, my wife, said, you've always wanted to write about Mark Rothko. You like Mark Rothko's paintings. Why don't you write some poems about his paintings? And I said, I was excited by this documentary I had seen years ago about Rothko's work. And Rothko is typically not a kind of artist I like. He's an abstract artist. I usually like more of the impressionist. But I happened to find the video on YouTube. And so I watched the documentary and it really moved me. And so I wrote 20 poems based on 20 Rothko paintings in about a month. I wrote 20 poems and I got all of them published. And they're all, they're in my first full-length book, Tragedy, Ecstasy, Doom, and So On, and the title even comes from Rothko. They're the middle section of that book. So that sort of kicked the ball off again for me in terms of writing after I wrote those poems in such a short period of time. And then I've been going ever since. And actually, I started writing this just before the pandemic started. But ever since then, I've just been on a roll with writing stuff. Every week, I seem to get something new, either a new poem or a new story, or maybe several poems. The poems I wrote based on Andrew Wyatt's paintings, it was kind of like a Rothko situation. I wrote like 18 poems in about 2 weeks. All based on his paintings, and I've gotten all of those published too. So people seem to like the poems about art that I write. And I actually we have an organization here called the Ohio Anna Library, and they do a pretty prestigious book festival every year. And everything had to be online this year because of the pandemic. But they asked me if I would sit on a panel with 2 other poets about ekphrastic poetry. And that was great. It was a really good panel. We got a really good response, but just to be able to talk about ekphrastic poetry and the relationship between art and writing with these 2 other poets, it was fantastic. And it really sort of generated several more pieces that I wrote after that. So yeah, the relationship between art and poetry, it's always been there. The modernists, they were really influenced by art. Um, so and I think my love for the modernists kind of comes out of their love of art. So for me anyway, art has been a real important aspect of my writing.
Okay, now I want to ask you questions related to your recent collection, which is Clean Coal Burn. So, okay, so first question about that is the title. So, yeah, so that's the work. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, so how did you come up with the title Clean Coal Burn?
Uh, I came up with the title. It pretty much comes out of politics, and this whole idea that you can have clean coal. It's a myth, and you can't. There's no such thing as clean coal. It's dirty, no matter how clean it is. And it became a big thing again when Trump was running for president, because he really courted the coal industry and coal miners, and he's done absolutely nothing for them. He did nothing for them while he was president. I think they ended up being in worse shape after his 4 years than they were at the beginning of his 4 years. But yeah, he had this quote about beautiful, clean coal. And Obama even talked about clean coal. It's just become a way of trying to get votes from this particular area of the United States, where the coal industry is very strong, and there's just no such thing as clean coal. So clean coal burn. I wanted it to be like people are getting burned by this concept of clean coal, and the environment is getting burned by this idea that coal can be clean. It can't be. So that's I wanted a title that wasn't very long for the book, and I wanted it to be kind of a statement, and I wanted it to be a kind of political statement that people are getting burned by this idea of clean coal in a lot of different ways, economically, politically, environmentally.
Okay, so there are basically four categories in the book. So, which is something in the wind, all the names for thunder, the birth sounds of lightning, and leaving a half life. I want to ask you about how did you plan to categorize your book, and why did you choose those categories? If you could talk about that.
Sure. Um, yeah, with the book went through a lot of different permutations before I settled on the final format. Um, but what I wanted to do, that the first section, Something in the Wind, these are the oldest poems in the book. And so I kind of wanted to start with the poems that that kind of launched my career as a writer. The very first chapbook I ever had published was back in 1991, and it was called The Weight of Smoke. And it was published with three other chapbooks in one large collection, and the collection was called A Red Shadow of Steel Mills. And they were all supposed to be poems that were either set in Ohio or inspired by the poetry of James Wright, who was one of the most famous Ohio poets we've had. And so all of my poems in that book were pretty much deep images poems with a couple narrative poems here and there. And they all had to deal with the coal mining industry and my grandfather's stories that my grandfather had told me. And the first poem in the book is that's kind of gotten to be, I guess, if I have a signature poem, it's the first poem in this book, because it's been anthologized in, I think, 3 different anthologies. and it's, it's a very short imagistic poem, but I thought I want to kick off the book with that because it kind of takes a bigger picture of Ohio, but it's using these very precise, minute details in order to talk about a sort of a bigger idea. And I thought that's just the perfect way to lead off the book. And the poems in that section all are these sort of deep imagist poems about the area. Then the next section is all about pretty much my grandfather. Those are poems that deal with, well, actually, it's both. It's my grandfather and then a father figure. What I tend to do in my poetry, there's a lot of autobiographical elements in my work, but the poems aren't necessarily autobiographical. I kind of approach poetry the way William Faulkner would approach his novels. I sort of created a version of this area of Ohio that I grew up in. And I create these kind of composite characters. Now, a lot of the grandfather poems, they are specifically about my grandfather. Then I move on to this sort of father figure who is not my father. And some people have made that mistake. They've assumed that the father in my poems is my father. And I've even had, because I kill off the father in this book, and I've had people say, well, I'm really sorry for your loss. It's like, no, my father's still alive. He's 86 years old and he's living fine and 20 miles from me. But I thought for the narrative structure of the book, it would be good. I had written, again, it's this sort of grieving process. And what I tend to do is grieve before things happen. At least that's what I used to do in my writing. My grandfather, when he got to be in his mid-70s, he had a lot of health problems and he just couldn't do a lot of the things that he did when he was younger. And so he just got to the point where he was sort of sitting around waiting to die. And so I started to write poems where I had killed him off before he had died, just because I knew I was going to have to deal with this. And I thought, if I deal with the grief before he dies, then maybe I'll be okay when he actually dies. So now I've started doing that with my father. I start killing him off in my writing. And so it's a way to kind of prepare for when that happens. It sounds morbid, I know, but it's a way to process grief, I think. And so the second section of the book kind of deals with the death of the grandfather and the death of the father. And then the third section, it's about rebirth and sort of the next generation after the father has died, then the son going on and having a life of his own, having a child of his own, raising the child, trying to get the child to understand his place in the world. And then the fourth section of the book, that kind of focuses on the environmental impact of coal on the area. And that's one of the things that I really kind of want to do. A lot of times people romanticize Appalachia and coal mining, and they turn it into this mythological subject. And there are definitely elements of mythology in that. But I wanted to try and sort of combine that with a more realistic vision of what it's really like. And people who are products of the coal mining industry, families who have had coal miners for generations in their family, they're very proud of that. And they should be, because the work was incredibly hard, incredibly dangerous. And a lot of times it was the only thing that these men had to do to make a living. And they should be proud of that. But there's, looking at the environmental impact is something that a lot of people in the area don't necessarily like to do. The state of Ohio and the federal government, they've put things in place that make them have to go in and reclaim areas. So they've got to go in after they're done mining an area and either putting it back as close to what it was before they started mining or make it even better than it was. But there are remnants before they had these reclamation laws in that area where they're just never going to be the same. The environmental impact is just devastating. And so I kind of wanted to show that there is this price that we've paid. And we need to keep that in mind. It's not all romantic. There's a cost, and there's a human cost. There's an environmental cost, and now because of the coal industry is just pretty much collapsed in the United States. The area of Ohio that I spent most of my time in when I was a kid, it's the poorest area in Ohio. The county that I spent all my time in, it's the poorest county in Ohio. It's got the high unemployment rate in Ohio. And it also has the highest opioid and addiction rate in the state. So people have paid a price for that.
Sorry. So I want to say that as you have spoken about these themes that you have written about your grandfather and coal mining experiences as well as nature, ecology, I actually loved your book. Your work seemed to be like a breath of fresh air. I felt like when I was reading those poems, I felt like I was with you where you were taking me. So I think that's a great quality as a writer. So I love the imagery in your work, and it is so different. I mean, usually we don't get to see these kind of works nowadays. So I want to ask you that your imagery shows that you are a very astute observer of nature and of life. So how do you manage to use your observances into your work? How do you manage to paint such beautiful pictures in your poems?
Uh, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think a lot of it has to do with the influence of art in my writing, and I think if I could be anything, I would love to be a painter, but I'm terrible at painting. I can't do it. I can't sketch. I can't draw. I can't mix colors. I'm terrible. I've tried doing it before, and I'm awful at it. So I guess, it's the old cliche of painting with words. That's, that's the page is my canvas now. And so I try and look at things as an artist would, I guess. And I want to try and, when I come up with imagery, when I look at something, I want to try and see it in a way that nobody else has seen it before. And a lot of times I want to have this juxtaposition between something that's beautiful and something that's ugly, because that's so much of the area of Ohio where I grew up. That's what it is. I mean, you've got these incredibly beautiful areas, but then if you just sort of shift your gaze to the right about 100 feet, you'll see something really ugly, like a tire from a car that's been there for 50 years that's rotting away. But right in the middle of that tire, there might be a clump of beautiful painted trillium. That's just what it is. And James Wright, great Ohio poet, he did that too. I mean, he was constantly exploring this juxtaposition between the ugly and the beautiful, and how there can be beauty in the ugly. I mean, he's got a great poem called "Beautiful Ohio," where he's basically sitting next to a sewage pipe, and it's just pouring out sewage into this creek. But in it, he sees the lives of the people in the town that he loves, the town that he called home. That's a product of their lives. So there's this kind of, and it's got this sort of rainbow glow to it that it's something really gross and disgusting, but he manages to find this element of beauty in it. So I guess that's what I'm always trying to do. I'm trying to look at things and so we see them from kind of two perspectives rather than just one perspective. I try and make things as three-dimensional as I possibly can in my writing, because I think it adds layers. And the more layers you can add to your writing, the better, because the world is it's a complicated place, and it's layered with complications and contradictions. And I think for me as a writer, I want to be able to communicate that to a reader.
Okay, so I want to ask you that about your poem, which is Living in the Rust Belt. So I want to ask you your process of writing it, what inspired you to write this poem, and if you could talk about the last line that I really loved the most, and that is, even the trees pull triggers.
Yeah, this poem was actually two poems. When I was putting the book together, I knew that I wanted to have both the poems in there. But then when I read them, I thought, well, they're really just parts of the same poem. So I put them together and gave it the title "Living in the Rust Belt." And I hesitated about the title a bit because there are some people who believe that the Rust Belt as a name for this area is a very condescending name, not a very good name. And they see it as a kind of insult about the area, but I think it's so apropos of what this area is. Because right after the book came out, I went and visited the small town around where I spent a lot of time as a kid, and the town, it's a ghost town now. It's the coal mining industry in that area is gone, but the town is pretty much rusting away. The creek that runs through the town is bright orange because it's filled with sulfur and iron, and there are parts of the ground that are literally rusting. And then there was, back in the 70s and 80s, they had a problem with acid rain, and it would actually make the trees look like they were rusting because it would turn all the leaves the sort of rusty brown color. So I don't know. I just think it's an apt name for the area. I don't see it as derogatory at all. It's something that people have had to survive, and there are still remnants of it around. And so I wanted to kind of get to that sort of environmental impact of coal on the area. But then the last line, even the trees pull triggers, it's sort of literal and figurative at the same time, because during hunting season, especially deer hunting season, the hunters wear camouflage, and so they're dressed up to look like the foliage of the area. So even the trees pull triggers. It's sort of a metaphor for what's happened to the trees. That the trees have some of the trees have become dangerous because of blight, Dutch elm disease. You can be walking in the woods and a tree can fall down while you're walking. And I mean, if you're not careful, you can get crushed by a tree. But also this idea that that men who are out there hunting in the woods and they're dressed as camouflage, it's like they're physically trees pulling triggers to shoot the deer. So I wanted to sort of have that duality with that last line.
I really love that line. And similar to this, I noticed the same juxtaposition in another poem of yours, and that is Preserve. So the last line of that poem, this poem reminds me of that. So I want to ask you about that as well. That what was in your mind when you wrote that, and if you could tell us about that poem.
So Preserve, is that the poem? I couldn't hear what you said.
Yeah, I was talking about preserve. So I was saying
Preserved,
that,
yeah.
yeah, so I was saying that as the previous poem in the Rust Belt, the power, the crescendo in the last line, and then this poem as well, that has the same quality. So what was in your mind when you wrote this poem, or is there any connection between those two poems in terms of themes or in terms of styles?
Yeah, I mean, stylistically, yeah, they're both definitely owe a lot to the Deep Images poets, and I remember Preserve is it's a very old poem, and it's sort of one of those poems that is pretty much just I think it's very much influenced by William Carlos Williams. People might say it's more influenced by James Wright, but I don't know. I see it as kind of um, a William Carlos Williams poem because I remember just describing this poem when I wrote it. I had we had an ice storm down at my grandparents, and ice storms are beautiful, but they're incredibly destructive. And there's just this moment when you look at them right after it's happened, before everything starts to melt, where it's just like everything is preserved, it's encased, and you think for a moment that it's never going to change, that the world has become fossilized before your eyes. And so that's what I was just trying to do, is trying to describe what I was seeing, but then also what I was seeing made me feel that here is this perfectly preserved moment. It's a moment that it's not going to last. Um, I know it's not going to last. I know it's going to melt. It's a dangerous moment because, again, when you're outside walking around the woods after an ice storm, branches can fall on you from the weight of the ice. But it just in that moment, if you could just stop and look and just see everything, it's just like a fossil. Uh, everything is just perfectly in a moment. And that's kind of what I wanted to get across in that poem. In a way, the poem itself becomes a fossil because I've kind of captured that moment in words, and those words aren't going to change. So the poem itself it's become a kind of fossil.
Interesting. So another poem of yours, words not meant to be spoken. So I actually liked it very much. I found the concept very fascinating. So I want you to talk about that poem as well.
Yeah, that poem, it it was written about a man I knew several years ago, who, well, many years ago, actually, 25 or 30 years ago, who he loved my poetry, and he got cancer of the tongue, and so they had to surgically remove his tongue, and so he had to write everything down on little yellow pads. And so he one day I was visiting, and he had been reading my stuff, and he just was writing down about how much he liked my poems. And he was a farmer, and so he had talked about how he always thought it was really beautiful in the spring when sheep would have lambs, and that the afterbirth of the sheep in the spring snow would just sort of steam, and how some people would be repulsed by that, but he thought it was a beautiful thing to see because it meant rebirth, rejuvenation. And so yeah, I mean, I wrote that poem for him, and that poem was in my first chapbook, The Weight of Smoke. And when The Weight of Smoke came out, we went on the four authors of the four separate books, we went on a reading tour. And the first place we read at was the James Wright Poetry Festival. They used to have one every year in Martins Ferry, Ohio, where James Wright was from. And the year that we read, they actually had Robert Bly and Galway Cannell, who were the two keynote speakers there. And James Wright's widow, Annie Wright, was there too. And James Wright died. He had throat cancer, and they had to remove his tongue near the end of his life, where he couldn't speak anymore and he had to write everything down. And so I read this poem when it was my turn to read. And when I got to the line, coal dust cut his tongue out, this woman in the front row just gasped. I mean, she just went, and I thought, oh no, I've really offended somebody. And after the reading, the woman came up to me and she said, my name is Annie Wright. I'm James's widow. And she said, you know, James had his tongue cut out too. And I said, yeah, I know. And I said, I'm really sorry. And I didn't mean to upset you. And she's like, you didn't upset me. She said, I love that poem. And I want to thank you for reading it. And then about a month later, I got a postcard from her. And she said, I just wanted to let you know that I carry a copy of that poem in my purse with me wherever I go. And that, I mean, it made me very sad, but it also, you know, it made me feel really good that I was able to reach out to somebody, because I mean, so many times we send our poems out into the world and we have no idea how they're received by people. We very rarely get to talk to people firsthand about our stuff. And to have her reach out to me and tell me how much that poem meant a lot to me.
Another poem of yours that I really liked in the collection is Inheritance. So I am reading the first 3 lines. So pardon me for mispronouncing any of the words.
You're fine.
I just want to read those lines and then talk about it. So the lines are, my eyes are so perfectly diseased. My ophthalmologist hangs photos of them on his office wall. So I love the imagery. I love this whole idea. So I want to ask you that how did you come up with this imagery? It's very unique. Like people don't mostly talk about, you know, eyes in this way, or, you know, I really liked it. So could you please talk about it? That how did you come up with this? It's very unique.
That's probably one of my most autobiographical poems. It's true. I was diagnosed very young with glaucoma, and the ophthalmologist who diagnosed me with it, he's one of the leading specialists in the Midwest in glaucoma. And normally, you know, people don't get until they're well in their 60s or 70s. It's generally considered a geriatric disease. So I was his youngest patient by far, and he said that my case of glaucoma was very unusual for how young I was, but it was also sort of textbook in its presentation. So he used my eyes for lectures that he would go around and give. So he had actually taken pictures of my eyes that he would use in lectures that he would give at conferences. And whether he had them hanging on the wall, I don't know, but I know that he did use them because he had to get my permission to use these pictures of my eyes in lectures that he gave, and he used them in a paper, I think, that he published too. So yeah, I mean, it's a it's a very autobiographical poem, and I have a lot of things in the book about inheriting things, all different kinds of things. We inherit the environment that we're left. We inherit the stories that we're told by our family, and this is more of when I became a father, thinking about the physical things that my son will inherit from me. And I knew I know that I've got diseased eyes, and so I wonder, have I given him my diseased eyes? And I'm just trying to find the poem in the book right now. Yeah, here it is. So yeah, that's
please read it. I would really love if you could read this.
Oh, okay. Okay. Inheritance. My eyes are so perfectly diseased. My ophthalmologist hangs photos of them on his office wall. I pounded my head on many walls until my pupils dilated like a doll's eyes, so I could see for myself the world where a mother drowns the son who reflects her father's face. I lift my son from his crib when he cries. I sing to him up above the world so bright, like a diamond in the night, but he does not stop. When I look into your eyes, the doctor told me as he shined a light into my pupils, I see an otherworldly sparkle. That's the disease. Holding my son, I think of everything I want to give him, everything I've already given him. My eyes study the curve of his mother's body as she muffles his cries in her breasts. Follow the snail shells of his ears as he settles into her and drifts off like another father's son. One thing with this poem, and I've always been proud of in this poem, are the line breaks. I'm kind of fanatical about line breaks. I don't know why. I think this was something that was pounded into me by the original poetry professor I had all those years ago, who put the chip on my shoulder. But I like to think of lines as poems within poems. And so in that last stanza, the three lines that begin that last stanza, I'm really proud of those three lines, because I have the line, holding my son, I think of everything. That's a kind of poem in and of itself. I want to give him everything. That's the next line. And then the line after that, I've already given him my eyes. So for me, when I read this poem, I think those are like three little separate poems within the poem, because when I hold my son, when you hold your son, your infant son, it makes you think of everything. And you want to give your kids everything. And what have I already given him? Genetically, I may have given him my eyes. So yeah, those three lines I'm really proud of. So I'm glad you sort of picked that poem out. It makes me happy.
I really like this poem. So now I want to request you that if there are any poems that you want to read, then please feel free.
Oh, I mean, let me ask you. I mean, what are there other poems in here that sort of spoke to you in some way, besides the three we've already talked about? I guess I could read. I'll read. This is probably the newest poem in the book, so I'll read that.
Okay, so there was this poem about coal mining incident. There were two poems. I forgot the name of those poems, but they were like side by side. So there was the small poem, and then there was a lengthy poem. So if you could read them as well as the ones that you want to read, then or anything that you want to read. So please.
Okay, let me see if I can find. I don't know if one was there's Lost Fires and Mine Shaft. That's a short one and a long one, or longish. I'll tell you what. I'll read. I'll let you figure out what those two poems are, but I'll read this one. This is the newest one in the book, and this is again an example of a lot of times for inspiration. I'll watch something on TV. A lot of times I have the TV on while I'm writing. It's very strange. I'll have like an episode of Mad Men on, or some documentary on, just in the background. I need to have noise when I'm writing. Came out with the documentary about country music about a year and a half ago. It's a great documentary, and I'm not a huge fan of contemporary country music. I love old country music. So the episodes that are sort of about the older country music really spoke to me. And so the episode that he has where he sort of highlights Hank Williams really meant a lot to me. And Hank Williams, huge country star. in the 40s, and he died. He was only 29 years old when he died. He died in the back of his car on the way to a show in Ohio on New Year's Day in 1953. So this is called Lonesome Appalachian Highway for Hank Williams, who died on the road in the backseat of his car somewhere in West Virginia, January 1st, 1953. I've looked for the moon in the sky all night, through the window frosted nearly blind with the swirls of my slow breathing. I'd like to think it's crying for me tonight, but somehow I know it's cheating with all the stars I can't see. I know nothing but death can stop the pain that storms like white water over my bones. Every rut in the road rattles through me the way thunder used to shake the window panes of my childhood Alabama home. Out of the glowing dash up front, I hear myself singing from a lifetime ago. Just like a blind man, I wandered along, worries and fears I claimed for my own. But there's nothing God can give back to me. The light has given in to an everlasting night. I didn't think the world could get any colder. I didn't think the snow falling like ashes could blanket me here inside this car heading north to Ohio and the next show. It's just a matter of time before frostbite finds its way inside and stops my heart cold. I'm proud of the first line of that poem because I wanted to I wanted to imitate the rhythm of his famous song, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. So I've looked for the moon and the sky all night. It's the same rhythm as his song. So little things like that, just sort of as a poet and as a writer, those are little challenges that I like to set for myself in my writing. And when I can make it work, I feel really happy about that.
A poem that I really like in your collection is The Moment I Realize I'm Beyond Middle Age. I would really request you if you could read that.
Okay. Yeah, that's a form poem, but I can't remember the name of the form. Dana is always finding new forms to write. As a librarian, she celebrates Poetry Month every April. And so what she did this past April is she would find some interesting form and she would write a poem in that form, and then she would post it on Twitter or Instagram. And so she would challenge me to write a form, whatever form she was doing. And this is a particular form, but honestly, I cannot remember the name of this form to save me. I've never written this form before, and I've never written one since. And this is one of the newer ones in the book too. So this is The Moment I Realize I Am Beyond Middle Age. I awake with moonlight piercing my window. Outside, I see someone on the horizon in moonlight. I see myself on the horizon staring back at me as if full of questions. Staring down at me as if full of questions, the impatient moon doesn't wait for answers. And I, impatient too, don't have the answers anyway. All I know is I'm wide awake. And now I know I'll always be wide awake because I'm heading for that damn horizon. I can't stop heading for that damn horizon, but I can still look back for the rising sun. When I turn to look back for the rising sun, I awake with moonlight piercing my window.
Wow. I really have no words. This is incredible.
I wish I could remember the name of that form.
Okay, so there is another poem, River Watch. So when I was reading that poem, so it reminded me of my high school days when I read Daffodils by William Words for the first time. So I would request you to talk about it or read it if you can.
Yeah. Again, this is a poem that's got elements of autobiography in it, and it's one of the older poems in the book too. And the thing that's true about it is, when I was talking earlier about the little town that I visited after my book was published, the town's called Corning, Ohio. And one day when I was younger and I was walking along the creek that runs through Corning, there was a dead deer in the water, and it was just completely bloated. And so I remembered that years later, and that's what this poem is based on. I sort of grew out of that experience. It's called River Watch. Sitting in the fork of a fallen tree, I listen to the river beneath me, look for the strangest bits of flotsam I can find. In the past, a nappy doll from Renville, a plastic hot dog from Hatfield's Burger Bar in Corning, a pair of logging goggles from Gloucester. Today, the bloated carcass of a deer bobs downstream, jams 5 feet away in the roots of my tree. I sit still for a moment, afraid to breathe, then reach down and touch it, feeling its death working to get out.
Okay, so that's about it. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm so honored that I got the opportunity to read your work and even talk about it to you. So thank you so much. So we will just end the recording, and then we'll have a chit chat for a while if you have any questions post interview, and then we'll end it up. Okay.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for
Oh,
everything. I appreciate it.